We are going to spend the next 20 minutes talking about a really exciting next direction for the Jupyter Book project. So first of all, in case anybody here isn't familiar with Jupyter Book at a very high level, essentially what Jupyter Book lets you do is take collections of computational narratives, Jupyter notebooks, markdown files, things like that, and with a single command, build them into a nice user-facing book-like multi-document experience. So this is an example of a book from a project called Project Pythia, which we're going to show some other examples from in this presentation. But it basically lets you go from a collection of documents to something like this that you can browse much more naturally as a reader. And Jupyter Book has actually been around for quite a long time. So it was initially created as like a very hacky collection of Jekyll files and templates in 2018. And it's gone through a number of different evolutions of its organizational structure, its technical architecture, the general kind of strategy and direction in which it's headed. There's now something like, I think it's 35,000 Jupyter Books that people have created out there in the wild on GitHub. And what we're talking about here is the latest, and in some ways like most fundamental step in the evolution of this project over time. And to begin with, what I wanted to do is sort of describe the motivating reason for this re-architecture and this kind of this new direction that the project is taking. And it really comes down to trying to bridge the gap between the exploratory and the learning phase of knowledge and scientific creation and the communication and publication gap. So imagine 3 different user personas, and they roughly span different parts of the knowledge creation lifecycle. On the one hand, you have learners and learning communities. You have people that need to gain new knowledge and gain new skills and start to dive into their work as quickly as they can so they can start to interact with computational material. Once they gain those skills, they become explorers and researchers and collaborators. They want to start interacting with data using the skills that they've learned. They want to be able to come up with their own experiments, run their own ideas, generate their own knowledge, and work with their peers along the way. And once you've created something that you think is polished enough that you want to share it externally or in a more formal sense with your colleagues, you want to communicate it, again, using the same infrastructure and workflows that you've been following thus far so that others can discover and build on top of those technologies. And in a sense, what we want to do is have a single ecosystem of tools and a single tool chain that can meet all of these different parts of the research creation, the knowledge creation lifecycle. So what came out of this goal was the creation of an ecosystem of tools that we call MyST Markdown and the MyST Document Engine. And this is tools, standards, composable building blocks that all come together to try to serve the different needs that exist at these different parts of the knowledge creation lifecycle. And that makes up the kind of core logic underneath Jupyter Book now as well. So Jupyter Book is an application that uses this collection of tools in the MyST Document Engine ecosystem. We imagine other applications to use these tools in different kinds of ways as well, and we'll go into a couple of examples of attempts at doing this from others. But at its core, when you build a Jupyter Book, when you use the MyST Document Engine, there are sort of 3 phases that we now flow through. First of all, you have a parsing and a resolving phase. So some kind of source content file, like an IPyNB file or a Markdown file, it gets parsed into the MyST Document Engine and then resolved. And by that we mean the engine itself builds up a model of all of the different relationships between cross-references, between figures, between the sort of like semantic information that is contained within a Markdown file you might have created. And then represented in an intermediate step in something called an abstract syntax tree. And this is basically a formal representation of all of the content and all of the sort of metadata attached to your content for the computational narrative that you have created. That abstract syntax tree is represented in a structured JSON document that we'll go into in a little bit later for why. And then finally, you can render and export that intermediate document into a variety of different kinds of outputs based on the specific use case that you might have in mind. And again, like these 3 steps are very intentionally separate from one another because we imagine a degree of pluggability and extensibility at every single one of them. And so the entire architecture has been designed so that you can kind of operate at each step along the way semi-independently. So underneath all of the technical architecture of this approach are a few different guiding principles that we defined to try to, in a sense, differentiate the MyST Document Engine ecosystem, Jupyter Book ecosystem from all of the other kind of document and knowledge base and computational engines that are out there. And I'll just list them off really quickly because we're going to go into each one specifically. We wanted this ecosystem to be simple to use and easy to extend. We wanted content that had a canonical source of truth and that was also machine readable so that you can access it programmatically. We wanted that same content to be modular and composable so that you can pull out bits and pieces of content rather than just take the whole thing all or nothing. And we wanted to build computation into it as a first-class citizen from the very beginning. So we don't want like the idea of a Python script to be a thing that happens separately from writing your computational narrative itself. We really want it to be embedded within the document creation and generation process. And then finally, we wanted all of the kind of governance and strategy and leadership around all of these tools to be governed by an open community, similar to many of the other projects in the open source ecosystem and certainly in the Jupyter project. So I'm going to dive into the first one, and then I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Rowan. At its core, we really wanted MyST Markdown and the MyST ecosystem to be simple to use and very approachable for someone who doesn't have like a ton of deep technical or engineering expertise, but with the capabilities to extend it in new ways to enhance its capabilities for different kinds of use cases. And to begin with, I think what that means in the modern era is you start with Markdown. So Markdown is a very common markup language. It's used on GitHub. It's used in almost every single document engine that is out there. And in a sense, it's the most accessible, approachable flavor for writing source material in a markup language. Here are just like a few examples of the bits and pieces of Markdown that result in more kind of enriched outputs. You have things like bulleted lists. You have things like dollar math, which is how you can define math symbols in a Markdown document. And then Markdown parses. It looks for syntax like the ones that I just described. It parses them into its own document model, and then you get like a nice output like this. Your bulleted lists become HTML lists. Your image syntax becomes embedded images or equations or whatever. But if you look at the use of Markdown in the world of scientific communication, you see a lot of hacks like what I'm showing you here, because there's no concept in Markdown for like a figure with a caption. So what you'll often see is something like image syntax, which I'm showing up in the upper left right here. And it's just pointing to a picture. Underneath it, you'll get like an italicized caption that's got a figure number hard-coded inside of it. And sure, like on the right, it gets rendered into something that looks kind of like a figure, but there's no kind of semantic information embedded in that document that says, this is a figure, this is that figure's caption, this is the figure number for it. So for example, if you added in another figure before it, now you've got to remember to go through and update all of your figure numbers throughout the entire document, right? And it's sort of left to the reader to make the assumption that this caption actually points back up to the figure that's there. So I want to contrast this with MyST Markdown. And this is an example of a document written in MyST Markdown, because what it tries to do is define its own kind of primitives for the most common, most important aspects of scientific communication and communicating with computational narratives. So I'm just going to point out a couple of examples. This is an example of something called a directive. And directives are kind of like functions, but in Markdown. It starts with these triple backticks. You get a little curly bracket, and then you have a directive name, which is very similar to a function name. You have directive keyword arguments just underneath it. In this case, we're attaching a label, which is like something that you can reference elsewhere in a paper. And then inside of that directive is the directive body, which is sort of the core content that is parsed by the directive. Another example is a figure directive. So taking an example that we just showed you before, now we can explicitly say in our markup language, this is a figure, this is the image the figure points to, this is the caption of that figure. And you can control other things like what it looks like when it's actually rendered on the page. Inside of that caption, you can see examples of things like references to specific labels. So this is a cross-reference to that figure that we've defined above. so that elsewhere in the text we can refer directly to the figure. And you'll see what that results in a second. And we can reuse the same kinds of syntax to refer to things like citations that would be in a bibliography. So in this case, there's a sort of formal definition for how you cite or how you refer to another object in a MyST document. So because you have these like you have a more enriched syntax for how you describe the different components that make up a document, you can do a lot more interesting stuff with the final output. So those references to other images inside of a document, those can render as hover previews that show you the image directly rather than needing to go there on your own with a click. Things like references to figures get automatically labeled and numbered with references that go back up to the figure, because MyST itself knows the list of all of the figures that exist in a document and kind of like process that at build time. So you can do a lot of other interesting things by having this enriched, more semantic content that's a part of the Markdown structure itself that you are writing as an author. And it also lets you do a lot of other interesting things too that are going to flow from the other design principles that Rowan is going to talk about now. So.
Excellent. Can you hear me? Excellent. Okay, so one of the other superpowers that MyST has is that content is canonical and it is machine readable. And so what that means is that from a machine readability point of view, every single page that is rendered, like this mystmd.org guide figures, if you add a JSON to the end of it, you actually get the entire structure of the document as a JSON document that has all sorts of additional metadata properties about who wrote it, what license it has, who the authors are, as well as the entire structure of the document itself in that sort of parsed form with figures and cross-references between them. And so just expanding on some of that sort of render pipeline that Chris was talking about, if you're starting with a collection of Markdown documents and notebooks or LaTeX documents even, the MyST engine parses that into structured content, and that can be rendered out into a number of different formats, either websites, it could be articles, tutorials, books, or journals, and it can also be rendered out to PDF documents, Word, or LaTeX documents as well. And so there, in terms of extensibility, there's also a lot of different community contributed templates in this ecosystem, both for the static document export as well as in the website's side as well. And so one example is an example that my company Curvenote is working on for the scientific Python proceedings. So there's about 1,000 articles over the 18 years that this proceedings has been around for, and we are bringing them all together and serving that structured information through an application interface to have much more interesting ways to actually look and sort of showcase the scientific knowledge. So in this case, in scientific Python, there's all sorts of visualization routines. If you're actually doing research into that, it's nice to be able to communicate in that same medium, and that actually changes the way that you can have and sort of showcase your research. We can also create PDF documents from that, and so this is the scientific Python proceedings template. So a very modern template. This is actually using the typist PDF engine, and so it's not using LaTeX. And so this is created in hundreds of milliseconds versus either up to a few minutes with a LaTeX renderer. And there's lots and lots of different journal-like templates out there as well for different sorts of PDFs. Another superpower is that the content is modular and composable. And so we're starting to see some examples of this with cross-references and citations to things like figures or code. You can hover over something and you can see that modular component brought into context through a hover reference. And so that is available for all cross-references inside of a project. So when you hover over figure 1, you can show figure 1 if you're 2 paragraphs above it. This also works for cross-references between projects. So because we're thinking about that intermediate standard of actually having that abstract syntax tree available, we can hover over something and pull in content. So for example, that visualization from a different article, we can bring that into context right where you're looking. And so thinking about this sort of federated content across many different communities, hosted by in different ways, but talking in the same sort of markdown standard. This is quite exciting when we're thinking about Project Pythia, which is using MyST Markdown. They have a whole lot of author-contributed tutorials, which they call cookbooks, that often build upon reference material in these sort of core resources. So in this example, they're referencing into that core resource a glossary, which talks about Binder and Jupyter Hub, and you can sort of dive down all of these links that are coming through from different parts of the community, but are sort of curated centrally and improved in that way. And you don't have to redeploy this entire resource. You're just working one cookbook or one resource at a time. So another superpower is that we have computation as a first-class citizen. It's built in, it's not bolted on the side. And so we're thinking about that all the way through. And so that includes thinking about the interfaces of how to use these tools directly in Jupyter Lab. So Jupyter Lab MyST is an extension which allows you to sort of blur the lines between the code cells and the markdown cells, and actually have markdown cells that have these roles that can reference things like widgets, and that you can interact with these directly in those markdown cells and start to show very sort of more dynamic text and visualizations that really elevate the reading experience. In fields like microscopy, for example, communicating a static figure is really not the best way to communicate some of that, because you need to zoom in, you need to see it over time. And so we're thinking about ways to actually expose that computation and actually dive in, change the bounds of those microscopy images so that you can actually see what's going on. We're also have an alpha out of Jupyter Lite, and so that computation can happen directly in the browser. And so this is showing some of those widgets directly in line that can be deployed without a Jupyter server behind them, because all of that computation is happening directly in the browser. This is another example from Project Pythia that is looking about computation. So it could be entirely in the browser, but often you have to have a deployed service like Binder or Binder Hub. In this case, this is a custom Binder Hub deployment that is running some of their climate data, but when you actually hit run, that notebook is fully executed. It can come in, those results can be shown directly in line. Those results, again, are interactive. So in this case, Bouquet is showing visualizations of climate data directly in line in the way that you're communicating that knowledge. So again, having that sort of full spectrum of exploration to communication all the way to publication of the results. Another thing that we love about MyST is that it is relatively simple to use, and it's easy for developers to extend. And so this is an example that an undergrad student did in about 2 weeks of pulling out all of the figures and putting them in an ammo bar on the side so that you can sort of look at the figures, you're reading the text, referring to them, and they were developing this and deploying it in a course-based environment. Another example, if you're using React, you can have whatever sort of website deployment framework that you want. In this case, this is using Next.js. You can define those custom renderers, and then there's a React component that you can pass the abstract syntax tree to and show that directly in a portion of your site. So it doesn't have to be sort of an all or nothing thing. You can pull components of the MyST engine ecosystem directly into the way that you're deploying your communication tools. And you can also pull in different widgets from the community. And so this is some custom visualization tools for genome sequencing. And then you can actually pull those in and show them directly in line. And again, have these sort of very custom ways of communicating your work that can improve the way that you're publishing and sharing knowledge. One more example, the data also doesn't have to be included in this bundle. In this case, this is 1.5 terabytes of microscopy data that you can actually zoom into, and there's all sorts of different visualization tools that are using tools like ZAR to actually store that externally in a data repository, and then be able to pull that in, visualize it, assess and sort of look at the metadata, and then jump into very custom tools. Again, trying to think about that exploration and knowledge sharing lifecycle in a very seamless way.
Okay, thank you. So the last superpower that we wanted to focus on is a little bit different from all of the other ones, but in some ways is the most important of all of them, in a sense. And that is that we want the MyST ecosystem, we want the Jupyter Book community to be an open community, to be governed and led by a collection of peers, organizations, individuals that work together to drive the project forward. So as a team, we have something that is quite common in the Jupyter ecosystem. It's called a team compass. This is a website, a document. It is itself a Jupyter Book that describes the structure, the organizational practices, the organizational principles that drive the Jupyter Book team forward. And one of the reasons that we have this here, other than organizing ourselves and having a source of truth for our own operations, is that we want it to be in a public space so that other people can understand the ways that we operate, the ways that we work, and hopefully can see a pathway towards them contributing themselves and potentially becoming a team member, becoming a maintainer on the project, becoming a contributor to the project in a way that makes sense to them. The project right now is made up of this kind of core team group of collaborators, although there is a much larger group of people that contributes to Jupyter Book quite frequently. These are people from a number of different organizations. Many of them are in this room, and we all kind of collaborate together to try to drive the Jupyter Book project forward, and often ourselves utilize and deploy Jupyter Book or MyST components that we've talked about here as a part of our own products, our own services, the use cases that we care about within our institutions. And in a sense, that's the beauty of a lot of the sub-projects within the Jupyter ecosystem, is you have people that are coming together to collaborate together on a shared technical project, even though as individuals or as organizations, we all have our own organizational objectives that we're working towards as well. So if you're interested in contributing to any of the pieces that we've described here, here are a couple of links that you might want to follow. One of them is a guide to the community. It'll kind of point you in different directions. Where do you want to go to have conversations? Where do you want to go to ask questions? Where should you learn about the work that we're doing? The contributing guide is an attempt at sort of pointing you in the right direction if you want to make contributions. Those don't have to be technical contributions. There are a lot of different ways in which you can support a project like Jupyter Book. And then an ecosystem guide is our kind of attempt at giving a high level, a map of the entire collection of tools and people and how they all relate to each other in this ecosystem. Because there's a lot of complexity there, and we're kind of doing our best to keep it navigable for people. But as I mentioned, a lot of the people in this group are actually here at this conference, and I think it's one of the great things about something like JupyterCon. I'm going to sort of volunteer everybody here. If you're interested in contributing to the project and you see one of these people here, please approach them and tell them that you're interested and ask them how you can help, ask them for guidance, because we would be happy to talk to you. And in fact, we want you to come and talk to us, because projects like this only survive and only thrive if people can come, join, and contribute themselves. So we would love your contribution. So with that, thank you for your time. As I mentioned, this is like a really big next step for the project. There's still a lot to be done. A lot of what we described is still actively being built. We literally just released Jupyter Book 2 as the kind of default pip install 36 hours ago, and are dealing with all the fires that have popped up as a result. So this is some beautiful bleeding edge, open source technology. But we're here at the conference. We would love to talk to you about this if you're interested in using or contributing or getting involved in any other way. And thanks very much for your time.